Long before psychology had a name, human beings were already mapping the inner world through stories. Fairy tales were never meant only for children. They were quiet maps of the soul, passed down across generations, carrying images of crisis, loss, healing, and renewal. This is the terrain explored by Carl Jung and later deepened by Marie-Louise von Franz, who understood these stories as mirrors of the adult psyche. Jung observed something simple, yet unsettling. When life loses meaning, it is rarely because we lack answers. It is because the inner authority that once organized our values, decisions, and direction has quietly weakened. Von Franz followed this insight into fairy tales, showing how kings, queens, forests, and illnesses symbolically describe what happens inside us when our guiding center collapses. In Jungian psychology, the mind is not just thoughts and habits, it is a living landscape. Within it exists an inner ruler, not a tyrant, but a principle of order. When this inner king is healthy, life feels oriented, choices carry weight, effort has purpose. But when this sovereign falls ill, the kingdom suffers, motivation dries up, creativity fades. The world feels strangely barren, even if nothing outside has changed. Fairy tales do not explain this with theories. They show it through images. A sick king, a dying land, a quest that must begin not in comfort, but in uncertainty. The cure is never found in the palace. It lies in the dark forest, the place we avoid, forget, or fear. There, something essential waits to be recovered. A truth, a value, a neglected part of the soul. This video, The Inner King, when the soul loses its right to rule, follows this symbolic journey. Not to offer quick solutions, but to reveal why healing is never about returning to who we were, only about becoming capable of governing ourselves again. And here is the question that opens the gate. When the leader within you falls ill, your entire world begins to wither. We often ignore the warning signs until our creativity and drive are completely paralyzed. Are you willing to enter the forest to find what can restore your inner crown, even if it changes how you rule your life forever? In fairy tales, the sickness of the king is never a private matter. When the ruler falls ill, the land itself begins to decay. Crops fail, rivers dry up, animals disappear. Nothing grows where life once flowed. This image appears again and again, not because ancient storytellers lacked imagination, but because they were describing a psychological truth that still governs adult life. From a Jungian perspective, articulated most clearly by Carl Jung, the king represents the inner principle that gives order, direction, and meaning to life. He is not simply authority in a social sense. He is the inner center that decides what matters, what deserves energy, and what can be sacrificed. When this center weakens, the consequences are never abstract. They are lived. You may recognize the withering kingdom without realizing it. Life continues on the surface. Responsibilities are met. Days pass, yet something essential has gone quiet. Creativity feels inaccessible. Decisions feel heavy or meaningless. Motivation evaporates, not because of laziness, but because the inner command to move forward has lost its voice. The land inside no longer responds. In fairy tales, the king's illness is rarely explained. There is no clear diagnosis, no visible wound. This is crucial. The sickness is symbolic, not medical. It suggests that the old way of ruling, the values, ambitions, and self-image that once worked, can no longer sustain life. The king is still on the throne, but his authority no longer nourishes the kingdom. This is why the land suffers. The psyche is an ecosystem. When the central organizing principle collapses, everything dependent on it begins to starve. Work becomes mechanical. Relationships lose vitality. Even pleasure feels strangely hollow. The world reflects the state of its ruler. Fairy tales refuse to comfort us at this point. They do not rush toward healing. Instead, they force us to stay with the image. A kingdom in decline, a ruler unable to save himself, and a truth that cannot be ignored. The illness is not an accident. It is a signal. Something essential must change, but it cannot change from the throne. The sickness of the king marks the beginning of a deeper journey, one that does not restore the old order, but prepares the ground for a different kind of rule. The withering kingdom is not punishment. It is the psyche announcing that the time of naive sovereignty has come to an end. In fairy tales, the most unsettling detail is not the illness of the king, but his helplessness. He commands armies, governs laws, and owns the finest physicians in the realm. Yet none of this power can restore his health. This is not a narrative oversight. It is the story's psychological warning. The king cannot heal himself because he is the structure that has fallen out of balance. His illness does not come from an external enemy, but from the limits of his own rule. Within the psyche, this reflects a moment when the conscious personality, the part of us that plans, controls, and decides, has exhausted its authority. What once created order now produces rigidity. What once protected life now quietly drains it. This is why fairy tales never allow the king to solve the problem alone. Any attempt to do so would repeat the very pattern that caused the illness. The ruler relies on familiar strategies. More discipline, stronger will, stricter control. Yet these tools belong to the old regime. They are incapable of addressing a crisis that originates beyond conscious command. From the perspective of Carl Jung, this moment reveals the fundamental limitation of the ego. The ego can organize daily life, but it cannot generate meaning when meaning itself has collapsed. Healing demands contact with something older, deeper, and less obedient than reason. It requires listening, not commanding. This is why the task is often given to a younger son, a fool, or an unlikely figure. Psychologically, this represents a shift away from dominant authority toward a more receptive attitude. The cure is not found through mastery, but through vulnerability. Not through strength, but through surrender to what has been ignored. The king remains on the throne, but he must wait. His role becomes passive, even humiliating. This waiting is essential. It creates a pause in which the psyche can reorganize itself. Only when authority steps back can something new emerge. Fairy tales insist on this truth with uncomfortable clarity. There are moments in adult life when effort itself becomes the obstacle, when trying harder only deepens exhaustion, when control must be loosened before life can return. The king cannot heal himself because healing is not an act of power, it is an encounter. And encounters happen only when authority admits it no longer knows the way. In adult life, the fall of the inner king rarely announces itself with drama. There is no trumpet, no visible collapse of the throne. Instead, it arrives quietly, disguised as fatigue, restlessness, or a persistent sense that something essential has gone missing. Life continues to function, yet it no longer feels governed from within. Have you noticed how everything can look fine on the outside while feeling strangely empty inside? This is how the loss of the central sovereign unfolds in modern life. We keep working, producing, responding, achieving, but without a felt center that gives coherence to our efforts. Decisions become reactive rather than deliberate. We move from obligation to obligation, not because we believe in them, but because stopping feels even more dangerous. Who then is ruling when no one is truly governing? From a psychological perspective shaped by Carl Jung, the central sovereign represents the organizing principle that aligns action with meaning. When it weakens, the psyche does not fall apart immediately. Instead, it fragments subtly. Energy scatters, priorities blur. What once felt meaningful now feels arbitrary. And yet we often blame ourselves, assuming the problem is a lack of discipline or motivation. But what if the problem is not effort? What if it is authority? Many adults reach this point after long periods of adaptation. Years of doing what was expected. Years of living according to borrowed values. Years of wearing an inner crown that no longer fits. At some moment, the psyche resists. Creativity dries up, desire becomes confused, even success tastes flat. Have you ever achieved something only to realize it didn't nourish you at all? The loss of the inner king often reveals itself through paralysis, not the paralysis of fear, but of indifference. Choices feel equally hollow. Direction feels arbitrary. We ask ourselves questions we never had time to ask before. Why am I doing this? For whom? According to what inner law? And when no answer comes, the silence feels unsettling. Fairy tales describe this state as a kingdom in decline because the inner ecology depends on leadership. Without a living center, instincts wander unchecked or retreat entirely. Relationships suffer, work becomes mechanical, pleasure loses depth. The world feels drained of color, not because it has changed, but because the one who perceives it has lost orientation. This is not failure, it is initiation. The collapse of inner sovereignty is often the psyche's refusal to continue living under an outdated rule. Something essential demands renegotiation. The old crown must loosen before a new form of authority can emerge. The real question is not whether the inner king has fallen, but whether we are willing to recognize the signs. Will we numb the discomfort and press forward blindly? Or will we pause long enough to ask the most difficult question of all? What kind of ruler does my life now require? The loss of the central sovereign is not the end of meaning. It is the moment meaning demands to be reborn on different terms. In fairy tales, once the kingdom begins to fail, the path forward never leads upward. There is no ascent toward clarity, no return to familiar ground. Instead, the story turns inward and downward. The hero is sent into the forest, not the pleasant woods of childhood imagination, but the dark, tangled place where paths disappear and orientation dissolves. Psychologically, this descent marks the moment when conscious certainty can no longer lead. The forest represents everything the ruling mind has neglected, rejected, or never learned to hear. It is the territory of instincts, memories without words, emotions that resist explanation. Entering it is not an act of courage in the heroic sense. It is an act of necessity. There is simply nowhere else to go. From the perspective shaped by Carl Jung, this movement reflects a turning toward the unconscious, not as a problem to be solved, but as a living reality to be encountered. The ego, once confident in its maps and strategies, must accept disorientation. In the forest, old hierarchies fail. Status means nothing. Knowledge offers little protection. This is why the descent feels threatening. The dark forest strips away identity. Roles dissolve. Certainties loosen. The traveler no longer knows who they are supposed to be. Yet fairy tales insist that without this loss, no true cure can be found. The medicine does not grow in well-lit places. It thrives where control has been surrendered. Inside the forest, time behaves differently. Progress is slow, often circular. Encounters are symbolic rather than logical. A stranger appears. An animal speaks. A forgotten path reveals itself only after patience replaces urgency. Psychologically, this mirrors the process of listening inwardly without demanding immediate answers. Healing begins not with insight, but with attention. Importantly, the descent is never undertaken by the king himself. Authority cannot descend while clinging to command. Something younger, humbler, or less defined must make the journey. This reflects a shift in inner attitude, from ruling to relating, from directing to witnessing. The psyche requires a different posture, one capable of being affected. The forest is also where fear surfaces without disguise. Old griefs, unresolved guilt, abandoned longings, all emerge in forms that cannot be ignored. This is not punishment. It is revelation. The unconscious does not accuse, it presents. What appears depends on what has been avoided. Fairy tales do not promise that the descent will feel meaningful while it happens. Often it feels like regression, confusion, or loss of ground. Yet beneath this chaos, something essential is reorganizing. Roots grow in darkness before anything rises toward light. The descent into the dark forest is not a detour from healing. It is the healing movement itself. What awaits there is not comfort, but truth. And truth, once encountered, quietly begins to restore the kingdom in ways no conscious effort ever could. Deep within the forest, the story always slows. The quest does not end with conquest or revelation, but with recognition. The cure appears not as a miracle, but as something strangely familiar, an herb overlooked, a ritual abandoned, a gesture once known and quietly forgotten. This detail matters. Fairy tales insist that healing is rarely about discovering something entirely new. More often, it is about remembering what was left behind. The forgotten herb symbolizes a living truth the psyche once possessed but could no longer integrate under the old rule. It may be a capacity for tenderness that felt impractical, a creative impulse dismissed as irresponsible, a grief never fully mourned, or a value that could not survive the demands of adaptation. Whatever it is, it does not announce itself loudly. It grows in hidden places, nourished by neglect rather than attention. From a Jungian understanding articulated by Carl Jung, this moment reflects the psyche's self-regulating intelligence. The unconscious does not offer random solutions. It compensates precisely for what conscious life has overdeveloped or ignored. When discipline becomes rigidity, the cure carries softness. When ambition dominates, the remedy introduces humility. The herb restores balance, not comfort. Equally important is the broken ritual. In fairy tales, healing rarely works unless a specific action is performed correctly, at the right time, in the right way, often with exacting conditions. This ritual is not superstition. Psychologically, it represents a necessary change in how life is lived, not merely understood. Insight alone does not heal the king. Something must be enacted. The ritual is often broken because the old order could not sustain it. Life moved too fast. Priorities shifted. What once grounded the psyche became inconvenient. The forgotten ritual may have been silence, prayer, solitude, craft, or devotion to something without external reward. Its loss did not seem catastrophic at the time. Only later did the kingdom begin to fail. Recovering the herb without restoring the ritual changes nothing. Likewise, repeating the ritual without honoring its meaning becomes empty habit. Fairy tales are clear. Healing requires both substance and structure. What is restored must be lived, not admired. This is why the cure cannot be generalized. The herb is always specific, the ritual always personal. No two kingdoms decay in the same way, and no two restorations follow the same pattern. The psyche demands fidelity, not imitation. When the herb is finally brought back, it does not immediately revive the land. First, it challenges the old hierarchy. It asks whether the king is willing to rule differently, to accept limits, to honor rhythms, to serve something greater than control. Healing does not negotiate with ego. It reorganizes authority from the ground up. The forgotten herb and the broken ritual remind us of a difficult truth. What heals us is rarely dramatic. It is precise, demanding, and often inconvenient. Yet when honored, it carries a quiet power, the power to return life to places that have been barren for far too long. When the cure finally reaches the castle, fairy tales resist the temptation of nostalgia. The land does not simply return to how it once was. The king does not step back into an unchanged role. Healing in these stories is never a rewind. It is a rearrangement of authority itself. This distinction is crucial. Restoration seeks to recover a former state, assuming the past held the correct order. Reordering accepts that the old structure failed for a reason. Psychologically, this marks a profound shift. The illness was not a random interruption of life's flow. It was a message. And messages lose their meaning if we rush to erase them. From a Jungian perspective articulated by Carl Jung, true healing alters the relationship between consciousness and the deeper layers of the psyche. The ego does not reclaim absolute control. Instead, it learns to listen. Authority becomes dialogical rather than unilateral. The king still rules, but he no longer rules alone. In fairy tales, this change is often subtle, The healed king may govern with advisors he once ignored. He may step back from constant command. Sometimes he ages, relinquishing certain powers to the next generation. These narrative details reflect a psychological truth. Maturity requires limitation. The fantasy of total mastery must die for life to return. Reordering also means redefining value. What once sat at the center, productivity, dominance, certainty, approval, is no longer supreme. Something quieter moves closer to the throne. Meaning, responsibility, relationship, or devotion to a deeper calling. This shift can feel destabilizing. The ego often mourns the loss of its former privileges. Healing demands sacrifice, not just relief. Importantly, the land does not bloom because the king feels better. It blooms because the inner hierarchy has changed. Energy flows differently. Attention is redistributed. What was once suppressed gains voice. What was once overemphasized softens. Life becomes responsive rather than driven. Many adults resist this phase because it does not feel triumphant. There is no sense of victory. Instead, there is humility, the recognition that something larger than personal will must be honored. Healing exposes the cost of previous adaptations. It asks difficult questions. What must no longer rule? What deserves authority now? What must remain secondary, even if it once defined your identity? Fairy tales suggest that refusing this reordering leads to relapse. The king may recover temporarily, but the land will falter again if governance remains unchanged. Healing is not about feeling whole. It is about living differently. This is why the stories end not with celebration, but with stability. The kingdom settles into a new rhythm. Growth returns gradually. The future remains uncertain, but it is no longer sterile. The center holds, not because it dominates, but because it relates wisely to what surrounds it. Healing, then, is not a return to innocence or certainty. It is the acceptance of a more complex order, one in which authority serves life rather than demanding life serve authority. Fairy tales rarely end by declaring who now rules the kingdom. This silence is deliberate. After the illness, the descent, the cure, and the reordering, the question of authority is no longer simple. The crown may still exist, but it does not rest where it once did, at least not in the same way. Psychologically, this moment invites a deeper reflection on leadership within the soul. Before the crisis, authority was centralized, unquestioned, and often unconscious. The ego ruled because it always had. After healing, that innocence is gone. The psyche has learned something irreversible. Ruling without listening leads to decay. From the perspective shaped by Carl Jung, mature authority emerges when the ego recognizes it is not the ultimate source of wisdom. The crown is no longer worn as entitlement, but as responsibility. Leadership becomes relational. Decisions are informed not only by ambition or fear, but by an ongoing dialogue with deeper inner realities. In fairy tales, this shift is sometimes symbolized by a shared rule, a council, or a successor who governs differently. These images suggest that authority has been redistributed. No single voice dominates the inner landscape. Instinct, feeling, reflection, and conscience are given space. The kingdom thrives not because one part commands all others, but because each part is honored in its proper place. This is the quiet maturity many adults struggle to accept. We often want clarity without complexity, control without uncertainty. Yet healing does not simplify life, it deepens it. The question is no longer, how do I impose my will, but how do I remain faithful to what I have learned? Wearing the crown after healing means tolerating tension. It means choosing balance over extremes. It means accepting that some desires must remain unmet so that life as a whole can flourish. This kind of rule lacks glamour. It is not driven by urgency or image. It is sustained by attentiveness. The fairy tale leaves us here without final instructions, because the answer cannot be given universally. Each psyche must discover who now carries authority and under what conditions. Is the ruler driven by fear, habit, or expectation? or guided by a living connection to meaning. The crown, after all, is not a symbol of dominance. It is a burden shaped by insight. And the final question the story leaves echoing is not whether the kingdom has been saved, but whether the one who governs it has truly changed. Who now wears the crown within you? And are they ruling in service of life, or merely preserving an old image of power? If the kingdom of your inner life has been slowly losing its vitality, what kind of authority has been ruling it until now? Have you been governed by habit, by expectation, by fear of change, or by a voice that once served you but no longer knows how to lead? And if healing is not about restoring the old order, but about reordering what holds power within you, what would truly need to step down so something more alive could take its place? These are not abstract reflections. They reveal themselves in how you decide, how you commit, and how you listen to what quietly asks for your attention. If this reflection resonated with you, I invite you to engage with this channel. Subscribe, like the video, and share your thoughts in the comments. Not as conclusions, but as honest questions you are still carrying. This space exists for those who sense that fairy tales speak to adult life in ways our culture often forgets. Thank you for spending this time in reflection. Stay with the questions, and when you are ready, join me in the next videos, where we will continue exploring the symbolic language of fairy tales and what they reveal about the hidden movements of the soul.